Hi everybody, it's Sally here, coming back on my LK video, series 2, and this is the second part of the ribs lesson. In the first video we did true ribs and hand knit ribs. In this video I'm going to talk about making a mock rib. If you remember, a mock rib is where you leave needles out of work. Looks like this, or like the ones I did on my hats, which looks like this. It's a nice thing. I don't know if you can see, but this is where the seam is coming down on this hat, and by doing mattress stitch it's virtually invisible, and if you get the stitch count right you can go right the way through the ribbing on it, and so you've got an invisible seam all the way round. So mock ribbing. This originated many years ago, before the domestic knitting machines had ribbing attachments supplied with them. I think the first ribbing attachments or twin bed knitting machines appeared in the 1960s, but ribbing attachments as a separate thing to go on the front of a metal bed machine sort of came in the 1970s. So prior to that, mock rib was the thing to do. And some of the older machines actually were supplied with a metal bar and a couple of clamps, which enabled you to finish off the mock rib after you'd knitted it, because the clue or the key to getting a really good looking mock rib that's going to keep its shape well is what you do afterwards, and that involves either wet blocking and pressing depending on your fibre, or if you're using an acrylic or a synthetic fibre, at the very least steaming it to set the stitches, which will give you a nice result. I see quite a lot of people demonstrating or showing pictures of things they've knitted with mock rib where they haven't really treated the hem very well, and that's when they look baggy and messy. So it's not just the knitting, it's what you do with it afterwards, I suppose, the message I'm trying to get across here. Okay, so mock rib is created by leaving needles out of work, and then you knit at a tighter tension. So the first one I'll do a 1 by 1. So you put alternate numbers of needles out to work. And I always, when I say out to work, I always pull mine forwards to D to begin with. As long as your rustle levers are at 2, they will always knit back anyway. And usually have an odd number for the cast on. So do my usual, make a loop in the end, hook it around the clamp and thread it through. Now for the actual waste yarn cast on, which is what I'm starting with here, I'm going to do it on main tension. Hang my cast on comb. Oops. And then knit back. Now normally at this point with the comb cast on, you'd put these needles from A to B, but you can do an alternate stitch cast on just by leaving them out of work. Right, I need my twiddly stick again. I just carry on knitting on these alternate needles. And then after a couple of rows I put the end needle at both sides out into work. So I've now got 2 stitches at each end. This is for seaming, and this is why I do that. And finish with the carriage on the left. Cut the waste yarn. I take my comb off now and put my claw weights on, because as you know me by now, you know I don't like the cast on comb. So there we go, alternate stitch cast on, and find my ravel cord and knit one row from left to right. Now in this version I'm going to go straight in with an open cast on here, so when you come to pick the hem up you'll need to put all of the loops on this first row here onto needles. On the second one I do, I'll show it with a closed cast on, so you don't have to pick up quite so many stitches, but turn your stitch size down at least 2 whole numbers, so I've gone from 4 down to 2, reset your row counter and knit double the number of rows you require for your rib. So if you wanted a rib of 15 rows you'd knit 30, if you want 20 row rib you'd knit 40, etc. So I'm going to do 30 rows here. Just make sure those end stitches have knitted through. And switch the yarn onto the twiddle stick. If you remember what I said before about if you get a tight row, make sure you deal with it. Not quite so critical on mock rib to re-knit it, especially if it was just the last few stitches, but if it had been the whole row I would have unravelled it and re-knit. Actually, I haven't got an awful lot of yarn left, so instead of doing 30 rows I'm only going to do 20. So there we go. Now, done my 20 rows, take the weights off, and now you'll need a transfer tool to pick up the edge. Now remember, when you're picking up the bottom edge of knitting, you're always going to end up with 1 stitch less than you started with. And as I had these 2 at the side here, I'll pick up this first bottom loop. Just move this slightly, get a better view of what I'm doing. Better. So that's the edge thread, and this is the first of the bottom loops. I'm going to put it on needle number 2. And from now on, all of these loops in between I'm going to put onto the empty needles. So if you put them onto the needles that have stitches in, and then put those empty needles into work, you'll end up with a nice line of holes across the bottom of your work. I mean, if you want that as an effect, by all means do it that way, but customarily you put the loops from the pickup row onto the empty needles. And as my last one, it's going on to its last but one needle here. So there, I've picked up all my stitches. You might like to push these out to D, making sure they don't pop off, or pull them out to D as you're picking the stitches up, and then rehang the weights, and that's your mock rib completed. Add your weights back on. Now on this first row, I will knit it at main tension +1 to stop it from flipping out, and then turn back down to main tension, and then just carry on knitting the body of my work. Right, that should be enough. So I'll take this off of here, cut my yarn, and remove the knitting. Right, so now I can take the waste yarn off by removing the ravel cord. So it would just pull out and the waste yarn comes away, and there you can see that you've got your mock rib, which looks quite effective. However, it'll look a lot more effective if you block it and steam it. Now, somewhere I have got a long metal ruler which I would use for a big piece, but for this small piece here I'll just demonstrate using my trusty tension scale. So what you want to do is you should be at your ironing board with your iron on, either with a wet spray or steam setting on it, and then you want to pull this out as hard as you can, and as you can see it's pulling that rib in tighter. And then when you've got it like that pulled out, steam it or wet spray it and leave it pinned out like that to dry. And then when you remove your straight edge, you've got a much more ribby looking rib. So that is a 1x1 mock rib, and this is your extra stitch at the sides for your seaming. Do your mattress stitch seam through that in the same way as you could do through stocking stitch, and therefore get a completely invisible seam. So that is a 1x1. Now on this one I'm going to do a 2x1, cast on in the same way, odd number of stitches to begin with. With waste yarn, let's reset it. It's on main tension setting again. So I've done it again. I've pulled out off-centre number of needles. Never mind, it doesn't matter. And this time I'm going to put these all into work. And I'm just going to double check. I want 2 in, 1 out, 2 in, 1 out, 2 in, 1 out, 2 in, 1 out, 2 in and 1 out. So I do want an extra couple of needles. So you actually, I think you want a multiple of 3 plus an extra 2. So I've got 33 stitches. No, that doesn't work out. Ultimately, you want to be able to set up a 2 in, 1 out needle arrangement. Let's hope I've done this right. Let's take that off. And like I said to you before, with waste yarn, don't worry too much if you drop an odd stitch or I've got a strange loop. It's waste yarn, it's going to come off. Got this dodgy needle over here. I'm going to have to check it when I get a minute because it keeps not knitting off very well. Probably just needs proper edge weighting on there. So now I'm going to set up my needle arrangement for the 2x1 mock rib. So needle 3, move it across, and then just pull out every third needle and transfer them. This is where a cast on rag is really handy. No, I did do one too many. I thought I did. Yeah, so multiple of 3 plus 2. I'll just get rid of that extra one on the edge there. And you can fiddle around and get rid of the extra ones or add the extra ones in whilst you're playing around with this on waste yarn. As I said, because the waste yarn's going to come off. So here's where you do your adjustments. stop on the left hand side again, cut off waste yarn, excuse me, and knit your 1 ravel cord row. Now if you are very confident at E-wrap cast on, you can omit the waste yarn section if you like. I mean I've been knitting for years, but I do still put the waste yarn section on there because it only takes a minute, and it does help to get your needle set up correct and get the weights in place. So now I'm going to E-wrap my main yarn. So I'm going to pull all my needles out to D. Oops. Yarn's got a mind of its own. Make a slip knot in the end of main yarn. Put it on the needle furthest from the carriage. And E-wrap across. And this is obviously going to make a secured edge, which means that when it comes to picking the hem up, you don't have to hook up so many loops. There we go, E-wrap. Now for the first row after E-wrap, I will continue to do that at main tension, just for the first row. So reset to 0. And then I will turn it down 2 whole tension numbers. So going down to 2, and then knit my required number of rows. Let's put him on there. So I have done 20 rows. Again, you will knit double the number of rows you require for your rib. So if your pattern says you need 20 rows, you'll knit 40. 24 rows, you'll knit 48, etc. So when you have done the required number of rows, you're going to pick up your open, well, you're not an open edge, you're going to pick up your cast on edge. Now, there should be a loop. This is pulled in a bit tight. There should be a loop right at the edge, which goes onto the second needle. Again, you're going to have 1 stitch less than your cast on row, and then you're going to look for the big loops that went across the gaps as you did the E-wrap cast on, and you'll put those on the empty needles. You pull them out to D if you wish. So look for the big loops, not the little ones. Hook on the empty needle. And as you can hopefully see or imagine, this is a lot quicker than having to pick up every single open loop from an open cast on. If you did my first series, I think I covered in there on how to make a cast on rag. Cast on rags are very useful if you've got an unusual needle arrangement. And when you get over to the left hand side, again there's a little loop which goes on the either the end or the one next to the end needle there. And so you've now picked up your edge. And stick a couple of weights on. Again, this row I'm going to do at main tension +1, Just think of it as a joining row. Joining rows are usually done at a slightly higher tension. And then turn it back down to main tension and carry on. I've nearly run out of wool. Oh, there we go. Let's cut that off and remove the weights. Remove from the machine, and as before, pull the ravel cord out. Your waste yarn literally drops away, and there's your 2x1 mock rib. And again, I would treat this as I did the first one. This is it an acrylic? Oh no, it's actually got 25% wool in this one, but I would still, as it's predominantly acrylic, I would treat it as an acrylic, which is to steam it rather than to press it directly with a hot iron. But again, you want to get something straight and quite rigid if possible. This is a little bit wobbly, and pull it out as hard as you can, and then while it's pulled out like that, steam it or wet spray it and leave it to dry. And afterwards you'll end up with a nice looking rib. So the finishing is very important on mock rib. That's really all I can say. Yes, I was talking about cast on rags. My first video series shows how to make them. You basically knit a bias strip piece of knitting which has these big loops up one side, and you can use them instead of waste yarn. So whatever your needle arrangement is, you can hook the big loops from along the edge on there. And hang your weights on. And then the important thing is you must knit a ravel cord separation row before you start your main knitting, otherwise you won't be able to retrieve your cast on rag and you'll have to cut it off, which means you'll then have to make another one. So whatever you do, if you decide to use a cast on rag, make sure that you do the ravel cord row. So that's how we do mock rib edgings. And I say it's you can do one. I usually only have one needle out of work, but I suppose strictly speaking there's probably no reason why you can't have two, but it might make it a bit more floppy than it is in any event. So 1x1, 2x1, 3x1, 4x1, 5x1, whatever. You can set up whatever you want as your needle arrangement for mock needle rib. So I hope that's been helpful for you. And this is now the end of the ribbing lessons. Next we're going to move on to hems.